Story 1. A young guy, maybe in his 20s and a distant relative of the bride, second cousin or something like that, got absolutely blacked out drunk, projectile vomited all over the dance floor. The bride's 72-year-old dad slipped and fell in it and broke his hip. That was a wild wedding. Story 2. I went to a wedding for some close friends. They are high school sweethearts. They are also just, in general, sweethearts. They deserved a magical day, but it went disastrously. Their priest died a few days before, so they had to find a backup. This guy was either drunk or having a stroke. He could not remember the bride's name throughout the actual ceremony. He called her by at least 4 different names. She kept having to correct him. Then during the reception, which was outdoors, the wind picked up like crazy. No one could hear any speeches, and everything started getting knocked over. Then it started raining. We were all shuffled inside a tiny room because there was another indoor wedding happening at the venue. So 200 people soaked and now cramped. The bride and groom decided to cut the cake and celebrate in spite of everything. When they went to cut the cake, the wedding topper fell off and the bride's head split in half. The topper bride, obviously. But still, the actual bride casually excused herself and had herself a very deserved moment alone. This was about 9 years ago, and they are still happily married. Story 3. Just a few hours before the wedding, the groom's father, aged 50-ish, sat in his recliner to take a short power nap and never woke up. The couple went through with the wedding anyway since a lot of family had traveled there for it. Just a sad day all around. Story 4. At one wedding I went to, the groom started complaining in his speech about how much it all cost and called out family members for not pitching in. It was so awkward, and everyone felt uncomfortable. Weddings can really bring out the drama. Story 5. Watched my friend's mom have a drunken meltdown during her daughter's ceremony. Took 6 people to get her out. She started drinking at 5 a.m., was asked not to turn up at the hotel where the bridal party was getting ready, and then broke down when she saw the bridesmaids' dresses were black and not pink like she wanted. Her daughter, the bride, wore royal blue instead of white. Her mom wanted nothing to do with dress shopping, so her future mother-in-law came with her. The police ended up having to take her away after the venue called them. Story 6. Guy had a heart attack while a prayer was being said, but he was adamant about not making a scene, so his sons dragged him out of the room while he was seated in his chair. While all this was done with good intentions, the chair screeching against the floor probably made more of a scene than if they had just carried him out of there. If I remember correctly, the heart attack guy survived. Story 7. The bride's entire family left to go smoke marijuana to celebrate. The staff thought the wedding was over since so many people left and started cleaning up. Then, the bride and groom had their first dance with the lights on and people sweeping around them. Story 8. Big family wedding many years ago. I was not part of either family, but knew both sides well. I didn't know many of their cousins. One pair of cousins, a brother and sister, did not get along at all. As is often the case at weddings, this simmered and finally blew up. The sister was visibly being unpleasant to her brother all day, making snide remarks from the very start. He seemed to be bearing it with good grace, presumably because of the occasion. On a couple of occasions when he seemed to be losing his cool, either their mother or father took notice and stepped in. I was seated at the same table with them, as were 2 other cousins and a few other friends who knew both the bride and groom. The sister continued her comments and making fun of her brother, really mean comments that made people uncomfortable at the table. At this stage, the beer and wine had been flowing for a while and the sister got louder. The parents of the 2 came over to the table 2 or 3 times to calm things down, mostly shushing the sister and calming the brother, saying things like, "You know what she's like," and "be the bigger person." During the speeches, she continued to provoke him until he very calmly reached over and pulled off her wig. She had complete alopecia, and from the gasps from the surrounding tables of cousins, this was a closely guarded secret. The sister was obviously very upset, grabbed her wig, and ran off in tears. The brother just sat back calmly, sighed, and took a drink. He announced he'd been wanting to do that for years. Presumably, he was going to catch severe consequences for it later on, but he was going to bask in the revenge and public humiliation of his sister for a few minutes. While I felt bad for his sister, it was hard to feel sorry for her. She had been unmercifully taunting this guy about every single work and relationship failing in a very public and nasty manner, and he had just had to endure it because of their parents' continuous interventions. It seemed like it had been coming for a while. Story 9. I've told this story before. The couple decided to use their black Labrador retriever as the ring bearer and to release doves after the ceremony. In retrospect, of course, the dog would absolutely lose his composure when 50 or so of the very thing he's genetically programmed to chase just fly out of a box. Like, they're called Labrador retrievers. They retrieve things. It's right there in the name. Anyway, all was calm until the minister opened the box. The birds started flying out, and the dog couldn't help himself. He lunged away from the flower girl, who fell and was now on the ground crying, sprinted the 20 feet or so, and tackled the cage box thing. For maybe 10 seconds, it was just a blur of screaming and feathers. He did eventually manage to catch one, and being who he was, he then proudly marched up to the bride and dropped it at her feet. Don't do the bird thing at weddings, people. Terrible idea for a whole bunch of reasons. No, the couple in question is no longer married. Probably not because of this. Story 10. My best friend in high school invited me to her cousin's wedding. We're both Indian, and you typically invite everyone to Indian weddings because it's usually a really extravagant party. She's been to some of my family's weddings, but she forgot to mention her cousin's Pentecostal. At Indian Pentecostal weddings, you invite people to give sermons and testimony. The more sermons you have, the better you look. And there is zero partying. It's sermons and a quiet dinner. I sat through 4 hours of prayer and sermons and had mediocre food around a bunch of people who also looked incredibly miserable. No alcohol either. Story 11. Former banquet bartender. So I have seen a lot of horror shows. 2 that stick out. Father of the bride performed a 45-minute drum solo in a sleeveless shirt. This one is sad. The DJ had a stroke prior to the wedding and was unable to operate his equipment. No music at all. Rolled the grand piano in and grabbed the hotel front desk receptionist who could play. Called in a backup. The poor DJ was in tears, and the bride and groom were sad. Story 12. I'm a wedding videographer. I've seen it all. The worst instance was filming a wedding for a professional National Hockey League player and his bride. It turns out, the bride had a thing for insanely giant dudes built like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and had the idea to invite her ex-boyfriend to the wedding. Everything was calm until the reception. My assistant and I kept hearing glasses break every minute or so. We thought, damn, these people are really partying hard. But then we heard the loud boom and crash of a table flipping over. And then another. Turns out the ex-boyfriend went into a rage and started smashing everything. Obviously, no one tried to stop him because he was huge. The bride was crying, and the groom went to confront him. It was a pretty even fight, but the police arrived quickly, used a megaphone, and yelled, "This is the police. This party is over. Go home now." Turns out the venue called them as soon as the destruction started. The bride was sobbing, and the groom and the ex-boyfriend were detained. Everyone awkwardly left, including us. I got a message from the bride the next day apologizing for the mess. Story 13. While I was not in the reception room, my mom dragged my husband on stage in front of all the guests and made him recite some words in a language he did not speak. We had discussed our unwillingness to do anything like that before the wedding, and she promised no surprises. Turns out, he professed to convert religions to her religion. He was a Catholic missionary. All her guests flooded over to the table his parents were at and congratulated them on his change of faith, which they were not happy about. I didn't find out until the honeymoon. That was the 100,000th terrible thing she did on my wedding day. I should never have invited her. My wedding anniversary is the anniversary of the day I realized my mother genuinely did not care about me. Story 14. I was a +1 at a wedding where I only knew my date and her mother. It was for a family friend of theirs. The bride's side was Italian and the groom's side was rural Ontario rednecks. Literally degenerates from upcountry. The father of the groom got wasted and had a fist fight with the father of the maid of honor. The groom basically tried to get his dad to calm down and stop ruining the wedding, and the dad sucker punched his own son. There were a bunch of people fighting after that, and I just kind of stood and watched. The reception abruptly ended at that point, but I remember that a lot of rented tuxedos got very bloody very quickly. Story 15. Best man here. Buddy, 100% American Indian. Wife Baptist and her father was the priest at the church. At the groom's dinner, the families argued about alcohol at the wedding. So the father, priest, said we could take his boat around the lake. The wedding was at an extravagant house on the lake that the bride's father, priest, owned, because there would be no alcohol at his house. We got back from a quick drink across the lake, and he sent everyone home because we were drinking, and he already agreed we could do this. He told his daughter, "I told you not to drink. Now I sent everyone home." She cried and cried. I never felt so terrible for someone. My buddy was as cool as you could be, told everyone to stay, got on the phone and called as many people as he could to come back. 4 hours later, we had the dance and cake cutting. All of the Indian side of my buddy's family, we all stood at the property line and brought an obscene amount of alcohol. Just partied outside his house line. I've never seen anyone do something that horrible to their daughter on their wedding day. Story 16. Still going to go with the priest asking if that was their first kiss because we were all like, the bride was pregnant, showing, but she hit it really well with her large chest and excellent dress choice. Story 17. A cousin was notorious for getting drunk and being a nightmare, especially at the bouquet toss. If she didn't hurt someone getting it, she'd rip it out of their hands. Once someone confronted her and she tore it apart right there. This was before cell phones, so it took a few times before someone showed her footage of her behavior. She cleaned up after that. Story 18. I wasn't there, but this one made the local news. A Canadian city in the 90s. A drunken cocaine-fueled fight broke out at the reception. The bride stabbed a guest. The groom and his best man said, "That's it, we're out of here," and sped off in a pickup truck. They were very drunk as they careened around the city causing vehicular mayhem. Eventually, they decided to go to a convenience store. The store was closed, so they drove the truck through the front doors. When the police finally caught up with them, they were laughing hysterically while loading up the truck with bags of potato chips and cartons of cigarettes. I wish I could find out if the couple is still together, but I can't find the original story. Story 19. Good friend got married. On the way out, they had the traditional throwing the rice celebration gauntlet. Everything was excellent. On the honeymoon to Bali, the bride began to get headaches. They chalked it up to overindulging in rich food and booze. Kept getting worse. She hung in there, but finally got a really high fever the day before departure. They endured, got on the plane, and by the time they got home, she was in major pain. They went to the emergency room, where it was discovered that a single grain of rice had embedded against her eardrum and caused a massive, ugly, and risky infection. Story 20. At my own wedding, my eldest sister arrived completely out of her mind and rifled through every purse she could sneak through, presumably to look for pills or credit cards to steal. She stole my middle sister's driver's license from the bar and ended up stealing her identity to take out about $10,000 in payday loans in my middle sister's name. My mom apparently found her rifling through the purses and didn't tell us until a couple of days later because she thought it wasn't her place. We had to call everyone 3 days after our wedding to apologize and tell them to check their wallets and purses to ensure their cards, cash, and medications were where they were supposed to be. We had to send out apologies before thank you cards. Yes, I cut contact with them for this and many other reasons. Story 21. My cousin and his wife got married in a Catholic basilica, but since they already lived together, the priest refused to give them the long service. He then proceeded to start his homily with comments on how God has a plan for us all, but it may not be the same as we have planned for ourselves, and sometimes that leads to divorce. It was wild. They're still happily married a decade later and have 2 kids now. Story 22. I had to kick out a somewhat known wedding crasher from my wedding. This woman, whom I had never met until the wedding weekend, had been trying to come to my wedding as a guest for months. She was dating one of the groomsmen. They started dating right around when my now husband asked him to join the wedding party, so it was a pretty new relationship. I got married somewhat young, so it was a low-budget wedding. No plus ones were available for anyone who wasn't already married. Well, she didn't like that. Over the months, she tried showing up to my husband's bachelor party and getting him drunk to get him to agree to invite her. She wrote desperate pleas on her boyfriend's RSVP card, guilt-tripping us that she'd bought flights already and was using her only vacation days to go. She showed up to the rehearsal, like the part where the wedding party practices their entrance and the ceremony, which is where I finally first met her. She introduced herself as Becca, but who cares? As if all the other behaviors weren't a red flag, that one really said something to me. We graciously invited her to the rehearsal dinner because we had some extra space. We thought that might be the end of it. On the day of the wedding, as I was nervously waiting for the ceremony to start, I saw her show up in a fancy dress. I was so over it at this point. She knew she wasn't invited. My venue came with security, so I informed them of the situation. They went over to kick her out. She wouldn't leave. They moved to make her leave. Her boyfriend showed up to see what the commotion was. She started screaming obscenities, calling me the bride, awful names. Then she screamed at her boyfriend, "It's this or me. Make your choice." Her boyfriend was not the kind of guy who stands up for himself. He was sweating bullets and in tears. They went somewhere to have a conversation, and he eventually did participate in the wedding, but he left at the start of the reception. I found out later that this woman showed up at the beginning of the wedding day at my reception venue. She lied to my aunt and said she was a friend and was there on my behalf to help set up. She spent several hours with my family members pretending to be my friend and helping them with the floral arrangements. After she was kicked out of the ceremony, she went to the reception venue and sat outside and cried. 5 years later, during COVID-19, I got an email from her out of the blue. It was written as a defense of her actions. Not a single apology in there. It was bizarre, as if she'd written it 5 years prior and had just pushed send. I wrote her back and said to never contact me again. She called me and my husband awful people who deserve each other and wished us misery for life. Again, I only met her the one time,